Greetings, beloved community of resilience builders, change agents, lovers of justice, and warriors of the human spirit. My name is Nils Palsson. I serve as Communications Director for Transition US, and I am recording this from my home near the Transition US headquarters in Northern California. I wish to thank you all once again for being a part of this historic gathering today, and even more so for being a part of this historic movement to transform our world for the better. This next segment is a panel, or more accurately an interview series, on transition and the wider movement. The question I came with, the question I ask our interviewees, and also the question that I ask those of you watching this, is how transition and the local resilience building movement fits in with the wider movement of movements, the collected efforts of all peoples working toward all forms of regenerative justice in terms of environment, economy, race, sex, gender, class, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, all those things that unite us and all those things that have historically been used to divide and oppress us. Because we're at a powerfully unique moment in our collective history, both in terms of the challenges we face vis-a-vis the climate crisis, wealth inequality, economic imperialism, war, militarism, pollution, repression, and so many forms of social injustice, and simultaneously in terms of the amazing grassroots solutions present and the ever-increasing vibrancy of this movement of movements converging to address the interconnected web of challenges we face. People are standing up, coming together, not only saying no to what we don't want, but also, perhaps infinitely more powerfully, saying yes to what we do want, and actually building it. Thriving abundance for all, healthy and resilient communities, social, racial, environmental, and economic justice for all. And here we are in the midst of it, in our humble transition movement, building local resilience, expressing locally the ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. Doing work that's related to, but also quite different from, the mass protests and letter writing campaigns and electoral politics and other strategies employed elsewhere in the movement. I recently heard transition described as hope with its sleeves rolled up, or as the Transition Network puts it, a movement of communities coming together to reimagine and rebuild our world. So I ask today's panelists, and I also ask you, how can we as transitioners more effectively collaborate with this wider movement? What are the one or two things that we can do to build an unstoppable movement of movements, to create that just, thriving, equitable, and regenerative future that we all long for? What follows is but a taste of what is possible. There are so many amazing and brilliant voices in the movement, and in this recording you'll hear just three of them. Asher Miller, the Executive Director of Post Carbon Institute and a member of the Transition US Board of Directors, Aleisa Myles, grassroots organizer with Transition Town Media Pennsylvania and co-organizer of the Transition US Social Justice Working Group, and Ruah Swennerfelt, a founder of Transition Town Charlotte, Vermont, and author of Rising to the Challenge, The Transition Movement, and People of Faith. I reached out to and spoke with dozens of stakeholders around the movement for this panel that I was serving to organize, and asked folks all around the movement about transition in the context of the wider movement. And while not all of them were able to participate in this call, the most regular themes that emerged in my discussions were whole systems thinking, that is, seeing our work as part of a larger whole that includes our interconnected struggles, and love, that is, meeting people where they are, with acceptance and without the need to make others wrong for being different, trusting that we each have a unique role to play in this movement ecosystem. One final disclaimer before I get to the interviews: as you watch this following segment, you may experience some Brechtian alienation as I break the fourth wall. I chose to leave in some rough cuts from these interviews just for the sake of levity and fun. Really happy to be celebrating 10 years in transition with you all. And with that, I am pleased to share my talk with these luminaries in the field, and I really hope you enjoy hearing what they had to say, as much as I did. Enjoy.
Okay, it looks like, yeah, it's recording now, so we're good to go.
Okay, great. So, and I'm actually going to edit out this part of myself speaking anyway, but
Sure.
can I first ask you to just introduce yourself, your relationship to the resilience building movement, and where you sort of locate yourself in the movement ecosystem?
Sure. So my name is Asher Miller. I'm the executive director of Post Carbon Institute, and I'm also a board member of Transition US. So I've got a very fond place in my heart for the transition movement and have since I became involved with transition back in the end of 2008 and the very beginning of 2009. So Post Carbon Institute is, I would say, we like to think of ourselves sometimes as the think tank for the transition, and transition with a capital T and a lowercase t. Our role is to try to help folks out there who are concerned about the state of the world, whether it's climate change, economic inequality, or other biophysical limits. Kind of understand what we're grappling with, make connections between a lot of these issues, and get a good sense of what's really required to address them when you think about them as a larger system, a complex system of interacting parts between the economy and energy and the environment and population and other issues. And we see ourselves as playing hopefully a valuable role in helping people in the community resilience movement not only understand those issues, but really think about how they go about building resilience. And so part of our work is to actually take lessons and important knowledge from the field of ecological resilience thinking and apply it at the community level, because we think there's a lot of differences in terms of thinking about human systems, but there's a lot of similarities in terms of thinking about complex systems, and so we try to help the community resilience movement think in systems, think about resilience in a really grounded way, and then try to point people to examples of what people are doing out there in the world around community resilience.
Beautiful, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So based on then your work in this think tank for the transition movement and looking at complex systems, how do you see the effort, the drive to build local resilience, the transition movement and other sort of allied local resilience building movements fitting into this bigger picture when we're looking at economic justice, social justice, environmental justice, and the wider movement? How do we fit in right now, and how can we optimally fit in with this bigger movement?
Yeah. So for Post Carbon Institute, when we do our analysis on the kind of the state of what we call the predicament, we call it the predicament or the sustainability crises of the 21st century. It's easy, and I think a lot of organizations kind of revert to this. It's easy to sort of say we have to deal with these at the global level, at the very large scale. A lot of these issues are political problems. They require large-scale policy interventions, and we think that that's true. But we see community resilience as not only an untapped area of focus from the standpoint of organizations that are trying to work on the kind of systemic change that we need, and also from a funding perspective. So not only is operating at the community scale kind of an underserved area of this kind of larger movement, it's also really key in terms of thinking about the kind of society that we need in order to live sustainably and equitably and have the resilience kind of in our DNA to respond and withstand the shocks that we're already experiencing, but are going to get worse as the decades roll on. So what we like to tell people is that it's not about disengaging from the larger scale. It's not about ignoring resistance efforts to exploitative practices, whether it's pipelines or it's things that are happening on the political level. But it is also putting a serious focus on, what's happening within the local community. And that's, partly because we are gonna, in our view, gonna have to live much more localized in the future as we're dealing with these issues. And also because our relationships with one another are one of the key assets that we have, and an area that we really need to focus on societally, because we're going to have to, there is no quote unquote solution to what we're facing. We're going to be responding to all kinds of shocks and changes, things that we can predict and things that we can't predict. And the way we get through those is by working collaboratively with one another, and our relationships with one another are really instrumental in doing that. If we don't have relationships with each other, we're going to be very much, in an us versus them mentality, which I think is kind of the last place that we want to be as people and as a society.
Thank you. And kind of a side question that I wasn't expecting to ask, but I see you're actually giving a talk tonight entitled Sustainability in the Age of Trump. When it comes to sort of how we as a movement choose to engage with political things that sometimes might feel outside of our wheelhouse in the sustainability or nonprofit, how do you see us, and you mentioned pipelines and things like that, like how do you see us engaging with some of these questions?
Yeah. So a question that we get a lot from folks is where to put their energy, right? Because there's so much, there's so much that needs to be done, and there's a real strong sense of urgency, right? And we're living in a time, we jokingly call it the age of Trump. It will not be an age, be a blip in the geological record, not even a blip in the geological record or the human record, but it is this kind of pivotal moment, and everyone's feeling that this shock and anger and frustration and all that, so how do you not respond to what's, the offense of the day? How do you not, take action to, to address, children being separated from their families, when they're trying to cross the border? How do you not, march in the street, in protests of a lot of the actions that are happening in Washington, D.C. And I would say to those folks, you have to do those things, especially when they feel right to you, right? And I think that people should be participating in what Naomi Klein calls blockadia, this effort to stop, especially, infrastructure that's going to last a while and kind of lock in, our dependence on hydrocarbons. So I think that there is definitely a need, and I do not poo-poo efforts of organizations and activists who are really trying to stop those things from happening. But at the same time, we have to focus on, I don't know if I would call them more aspirational, but they're more long-term oriented, responses. And that really is at the community scale. So I think it comes down for individuals to what is right for them as people. I think that within the transition movement or the community resilience movement writ large, or the kind of progressive movement or larger movement of social change that we're all trying to participate in, everyone has to find their calling in that. There is no shortage of things to get involved in. But when we think of it from kind of a more collaborative perspective, I would say we have to be engaging in all those areas, right? And so if you're seeing a gap in there, and you're compelled and called to step into that gap, do so. And then maybe that is acting politically, and maybe that's acting, in terms of civil disobedience, and then maybe that's acting in terms of doing nuts and bolts community resilience work, in your neighborhood or in your city.
Beautiful, thank you. Very well spoken, well said.
Yeah.
So then maybe finally, when it comes back to the community resilience building movement and our transition aligned efforts, are there one or two things that you can identify that we can do, people who are watching this and identifying as local resilience builders, to form a more successful movement as we as we kind of look ahead, and there's a lot of unpredictable things, but when we look ahead to the next decade, what are a couple of things that we can do to form a more successful movement?
Yeah, so when we think about how to be successful in the context of what we're facing, particularly those of us that are working on community resilience efforts, transition or otherwise, um, if I think about what are a few areas to kind of engage in, one thing is making this work relevant to people and meeting them where they are. When we think about where those of us who are in the community resilience movement, whether we're involved in transition or other efforts, when we think about places to kind of intervene in the context of where we are right now, as I mentioned before, there was no shortage of places. But if I were to recommend a couple things to folks to think about, one would be making this work relevant to people and meeting them where they are. I remember hearing a woman named Lois Gibbs, who was one of the homemakers living in New Jersey, who was affected by Love Canal. So it was one of these famous, really inspiring examples of communities stepping up and going after, polluters. In the 1970s, Lois gave this talk once, and she shared a story when she was invited to this neighborhood, I think in New York, one of the boroughs, and low-income community, predominantly I think African American, that was trying to oppose a new distribution plant or some kind of large-scale industrial operation that was going to really affect the health and well-being of the community there. And these organizers, they're really concerned about the environmental impact of this. Try to do an event in the community and draw people out, and they invited her to come speak, and kind of nobody showed up. And the organizers were horrified, and they felt terrible, and they were worried that they wasted Lois's time. And they went out to sort of this bar afterwards, and they were sort of talking about it. And she asked them, well, how did you reach out to folks? And they'd done sort of the typical thing, and she said, well, you got to meet people where they are. And she said, let me go talk to that guy sitting up at the bar and find out what he knows about it and what he thinks about it. And she went up to him, and he was watching a football game on the television, and he didn't want to talk to her, so she had to wait until it was commercial time. And she asked him if he knew about this thing. He's like, oh, I don't care about environmental crap. And she said, well, what do you care about? And he said, well, I'm a truck driver. I got to drive my truck. I'm doing deliveries all the time, and there's this light up here in the neighborhood where, like, I got to wait there for like 10 minutes to take a left. It's driving me crazy. And she said, well, what do you think is going to happen when this new plant comes in to traffic? They're going to be, bringing lots more trucks back and forth. And it's like, oh man, that's going to make it worse. And he got all up in arms about this thing. And that sort of led him to think, well, I don't want this thing in this neighborhood, and that was just, to me, a really telling example of trying to understand what people's priorities are and making connections for them, And as I was saying before, there are lots of outrages right now. There are lots of things that people are upset about and very urgent, immediate concerns that people have. So one of the things I think we need to do a better job of is making connections between kind of the longer term, larger scale community resilience work that needs to be done and the more immediate concerns that people have. And there's lots of ways to do that because these things are all interrelated, which gets me to maybe a second suggestion I may make for folks, and that is take the time to orient yourself and then orient others around the true nature of what we're facing here. Because a lot of what we see as well for folks that are concerned, for example, with climate change is they get that we need to stop, extracting and burning fossil fuels as much and as quickly as possible. That often leads them to advocate for renewable energy, and they think of it as a political problem. We need to elect people that are, are concerned about climate change or in favor of renewables and opposed to fossil fuels, and that's right. But when you take a more of a systems approach to understanding that climate change is actually a symptom of a larger, societal overshoot that we're going through, and that there are lots of challenges in this transition from from fossil fuels to renewable energy, that we're going to have to go deeper than that. It's going to require, really transformational changes, not just in terms of not driving a fossil fuel car and driving an electric vehicle or having solar panels on the roof of our house. It's going to require changes in our food system. It's going to require changes in our economy. It's going to require changes in consumption, all kinds of things. So there's not going to be a single solution to these issues. And in fact, it's for that reason that we advocate community resilience, because of that very nature of that. And so I think it's important for us to get grounded and think systemically about things, not only the challenges that we're facing, but think systemically about where we intervene in the system, and make sure that the things that we're doing are ones that can either have like a sort of a positive feedback loop change, or have these additional benefits to the community. And so I would recommend, starting with getting that orientation ourselves, and then trying to provide other people with that, because oftentimes we get people who, come to meetings and they're just focused on this one thing. They think this one thing is going to be the solution, and maybe that one thing is part of it, but is not the end all be all solution. And when we have a systemic orientation, we understand that it's going to actually take a whole series of interventions, a whole series of kinds of actions that we need to take. And then maybe we can have a larger tent, in the sense of the kinds of things that we're working on and the kinds of people that we draw into this work.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Sherry. You've given us, I think, some really good medicine and something great to work with. Are there any final, sort of on our 10-year anniversary, this little 10-year mark, any final closing words?
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting for me that Transition US is 10 years old, right? I was fortunate enough to be there for not the inception of, Transition when it first came to the United States, although I observed that. At Post Carbon Institute, we actually had a network called the Relocalization Network that preceded Transition in some ways. And I was involved in those efforts. And then when Transition came around, Richard Heinberg, who I worked with, heard about this young guy, Rob Hopkins, not so young anymore, sorry, Rob, over in Kinsale first, and then, at Totnes, and went and visited and got super excited about it and was like spreading the word, in Australia and the United States, and then hearing other people who were kind of really excited about like the Transition Handbook when it came out. So that was my first introduction to Transition. And then I was lucky enough, I think, to be part of the inception of Transition US as an organization, and certainly been a strong proponent and advocate ever since. And I think our movement has gone through ups and downs. It's been a very interesting decade, for us as a country, and for this movement collectively. There's been lots of moments of, and we're kind of in one of those right now where we're like, holy crap, I can't believe that we're here, but at the same time, I look at this and say, this is all part of the sort of breaking apart of an old system that has to break apart to make room for a new system, and so I would, caution people to recognize we're in this for the long game, and that this is all part of the transformation, the transition that needs to unfold. And I just feel really honored to be part of it, and I still believe that Transition is sort of the best model that's out there, this work. So keep at it, folks. We need you.
We are recording. The gods have heard us. Okay. So, and I'll be able to edit this out right now. So if you want to make any goofy faces or okay. So the first question is just, can you tell us a little bit, who you are and how you relate to the transition movement and where you locate your work in the wider movement ecosystem?
Hi, I'm Aleisa Myles. I'm from Transition Town Media in Pennsylvania, and my work is just a small particle in a large wave. I'm one person, but I feel like I can be part of what's happening here in my town, in my community, get to have a voice in that. And then it's really fun to connect with people in my region, in the Mid-Atlantic region here, and then also to connect with people around the country as part of Transition US and some of the new efforts and working groups that are starting up around the country. I've been part of the transition movement since about 2010, and I've really enjoyed working on local food issues and inner transition or shifting our consciousness, and just being part of this community, being part of making the world become what I know it can be.
Thank you, Aleisa. And Ruah, same question, if you could just introduce yourself and where you're sort of positioned in this movement.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ruah Swennerfelt. I'm a member of Charlotte Transition in Vermont. And we've actually been an initiative since about 2008, maybe earlier. No, 2008. And we have felt that it was always really important to make the connections with other people, other groups in our own town that are doing similar kinds of work, and be collaborators in all of that. We've also worked, I personally have worked at being a part of people in other transition initiatives in Vermont. And I have done some travel to meet people in transition initiatives in Europe as well. So I'm a great believer in this movement and see that it's an important piece of the overall work for peace and justice, for workers' rights, and for resilience.
Thank you, Ruah. And that kind of gets into what I'm thinking of for the next question here, which is when we look at the bigger picture of what's going on in our world today, kind of a complex situation and a vibrant movement that includes environmental justice, social justice, racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, everything that we're dealing with, and pipelines and borders and all of these big war and peace questions of our time. And then we've got our work that we do in the transition movement with our feet on the ground and our hands in the dirt, and getting into circles. And how do you see the transition and local resilience movement fitting in with this bigger picture of the movement of movements, both presently and then maybe optimally?
This is Aleisa, and I really see transition as integral to the larger movement of movements. We have so many converging issues in our world where there are troubles and crises economically, racially, socially, and environmentally. And oftentimes in this world, in each of the movements that is happening, people are working to patch up the bucket that we're in right now, to patch up the holes in the bucket. And I think what transition does really well is to help us imagine and envision and begin to build a new bucket. And it's challenging to do all of that at the same time. I think it's really important that we do collaborate with other movements. And because transition is a holistic view and a holistic process, I think there's a wonderful way in which we can integrate the work that we do with other movements, and we need every one of these movements. I think that when we talk about economic justice and new economic models, sharing economies, gift economies, when we talk about social justice, racial justice, building a world that's more racially equitable, we have to really imagine and create something that is so counter to the dominant ideology and to the oppressive system that exists now. And so a lot of it is a learning in process and learning with others, finding those spaces where we can talk to people that across all kinds of different groups and meetings and gatherings, and learn how to have those dialogues. And I think that when we talk about these many models and many movements, transition is helpful in thinking about how, just like plant species in a permaculture forest, in an edible forest, all depend on each other. All life is interconnected. I believe all our movements are interconnected and we need all of them. And that as these movements are growing and strengthening with time, and there is a growing awareness of the need for these movements, we are creating the leadership and the infrastructure, the consciousness infrastructure of our future world. And it's delightful to be a part of it.
Wow, that's great.
Consciousness infrastructure.
Yeah.
Love it.
Wonderful.
And Ruah, same question. Do you need me to restate it, or do you feel like you can just jam?
No, I know I've got an old brain, but I get the gist. I just had an argument recently with a good friend when I was talking about the transition movement, and he was like, "Well, it's not going to happen in communities. It's not. We've got to work at the larger structure." And it's a very common dynamic, a very common argument to have. And I think by the time we finished the argument that he could understand that community by community, we can build that larger infrastructure that attends to all the different issues. That if we're working just at the federal level, that it's going to be piecemeal, but we have the opportunity, because we're in these communities, if we don't collaborate with others in the community, including those who think differently from us. I've worked really hard to make friends with people who think differently or vote differently, because we have to engage with everyone. And so if we look at each transition initiative as a microcosm, then we begin to see how it fits into the macro, that we see that we are building a huge movement of movements in the United States, community by community, state by state, but only through the collaboration with the others. And if we don't deal with the issues of all the different kinds of justice and equality for all, we're missing out. We're being isolationist. We have to understand our role as one of many. And it's exciting. It's exciting. If I thought I was in some little group of 20 people and that was it in the world, I'd give up. But I wake up every morning knowing that what we're doing in our little town of 4,500 people is just one piece of what's happening everywhere.
Very beautiful. Thank you. That kind of brings me to my final question, at least for now, which deals with, what you said, people who think differently from us. And that could be maybe people who are, consciously part of the movement of movements, and they are all about environmental justice or social justice, but approaching it from a different lens from transition. Maybe they're more concerned with, fighting against sexual violence or uniting families at the border. Or maybe they're not, they think activist is a bad word and they're concerned with property rights and, making the most money possible. However, our brothers and sisters out there are approaching the movement, there is a question of what is the one thing, maybe two, that we could do in the transition movement, in the local resilience movement right now to more effectively reach out and build bridges. So I wonder if you have any one or two pointers that you might share with your colleagues out in the transition movement.
It can seem like people are so different, coming from different approaches and movements. People may have different focuses, and yet, in some sense, our separation is very much an illusion, in that every human being has value and counts, and it's up to us to see how that is true. And so for those who are focusing on immigrants' rights, and for those who are focusing on frontline communities facing climate change, and for those who are believing that the status quo is the way to go and want to keep things the way they are, I think that it's necessary for us to open doors to everyone and to see really what everyone's gifts are, because everyone has some gifts to contribute in this world. And oftentimes when we're not able to see the gifts that people have, or that we ourselves have to offer, then fear comes in. And so I believe that in building the movement of movements, it's very important for us to humbly get to know what everyone's gifts are, even if it seems that people are coming from a very different place. And some of that means reaching out and creating opportunities for us to talk together, collaborate together, share a common purpose. And the community level is one of the most excellent scales and places to do that, in that it's a small enough scale that we can see where having a festival, or having a new garden planted that people can share food from, or having a get together or a potluck in our community, those are the kinds of things that we can agree on, oftentimes, or at least places where we can begin those conversations. And so I look forward to that. And I think finding the places where there are surprises and where there are unexpected things that happen, those are often the most exciting edge spaces, and unexpected possibilities can arise from there. And so waking up our imaginations to where our movements can collaborate, and believing very much that we can, is essential in doing this work. And I'm excited to see where it will go in the next 10 years.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
So I was a person who did a lot of work on peace and justice issues, leading to multiple arrests, justice for people in Central America when our government was providing weapons there. I did a lot of work on feeding homeless people. And I was at a conference in Honduras, and I picked up a booklet, and in the booklet was a quote, "There'll be no peace without a planet." And it was such a wake-up call to understand that we can't isolate these issues, that they're all interrelated. And that if I wanted people to be fed well and to be safe, that I had to care about the food being healthy, the soil being healthy that fed them, that the air was clean, and recognize that nuclear power plants created hazardous environments for people to see all those interconnections. So the issues of racial justice or gender justice or workers' justice or migrant justice or earth justice, there is no separate, it's justice. And that's what we have to do. And then in our transition initiatives, we have to understand that, respect and incorporate others in that work that are working for all those pieces. And we have the ability as the transition initiative to be the network that brings people together who are all doing isolated work because we see it as a whole.
Super beautiful. Thank you both for the deep wisdom that you've shared here. Are there any final thoughts or words that you'd like to share? Any little bits that didn't make it through, or anything that you'd like to say to your fellow transitioners out there on this 10th anniversary?
Nils, what about you? I'm sure you have some interesting thoughts about these questions too.
I'm just the moderator. No, I mean, what I'll do is I'm going to take all of these bits and kind of I'll do a little intro at the beginning, and I feel I just defer to your wisdom completely, because I wish to have been able to say something half as eloquent as either of you just said.
Aww,
I'm
pretty eloquent.
Honored to be led by such powerful and amazing women. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for asking. And we'll see each other on Wednesday.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Good luck editing.
Thanks again. Really appreciate you guys for being available at the last minute and everything that you do for this movie. And there you have it. Perhaps cut off a little bit in the end there, but I'm thanking Asher Miller, Aleisa, Myles, and Ruah Swennerfelt for participating in this conversation and for the amazing work that they do in this movement. I encourage all our viewers to harvest and expand on any of these treasures that stuck out for you during this talk, and I bless that your resilience building work be ever enriched and expanded by the brilliance surrounding us in this diverse movement. Because that's where our real strength and resilience is, right? With each other. Before closing, I wish to share a quick plug for our next Transition National Gathering in the summer of 2019, as well as our ongoing national network calls, where transitioners from all around the country gather on Zoom as a video conference to discuss questions just like this one today with kindred and also different people from all around the country. You'll hear more about the upcoming national gathering and the ongoing network calls later in the broadcast. But if your interest is at all piqued by the topics we've discussed here on this panel or in other parts of today's online summit, I really invite you to check that out, because the brilliance represented here in the voices of these individuals speaking today really represent but a glimpse of the collective genius that we have access to and that we are currently unleashing through our participation in this transition movement. You can find out information about upcoming calls and trainings, as well as a newly posted recording of our last national network call on transition, politics, and social justice at our website, transitionus.org. With that, I'll offer up some final thanks and bring this recording to a close. Really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all the work and the play that you do in service of this movement to make our world a more thriving, abundant, just, and awesome place. This is Nils Palsson for Transition US signing off. One love.